perfect. There we go. Cool.
All right. So, yeah, today I'll talk to you a bit about pivotal mental states, the article, and then I'll present some ideas I've been working on since then about extending the model. Yeah. So my name is Ari. If anyone has questions about the piece or any of these ideas, feel free to email me at this email or at the one on the paper. That's fine too. I'm now affiliated with University of Wisconsin in Madison. So let's get into it. Can everyone hear me all right? Thumbs up. Yeah, okay, perfect. All right. Actually got to minimize the video so I don't. So outline of the lecture. First, I'll review pivotal mental states, and then I'll present three extensions of the model. One's a psychotomimetic sensitization model of psychosis. So this kind of looks at psychedelics alongside other models of psychosis, other drug models of psychosis, which would be cannabis or THC or other cannabinoid receptor agonists, NMDA receptor antagonists, so ketamine or PCP, and what's the fourth off the top of my? Oh, amphetamines, of course. So methamphetamines and stuff like that. Understanding how all those systems work together kind of is a good way to understand how psychedelics might contribute or not contribute to psychosis. Then I'll do a brief kind of riff on this look at psychedelics, psychotic-like worldviews and counterculture. And then I'll present a little bit about adaptive stressors for mental health. So instead of just using psychedelics for mental health purposes, can we use stressors that engage potentially psychedelic signaling to increase mental health, such as exercise or hyperthermia or fasting? So some quick acknowledgements, and I'll use this screen to give a little background on myself. A lot of what I see my work is doing is kind of building on these old school kind of philosophers, comparative scholars of religion, a kind of an approach that isn't popular anymore, but these are just some of the fundamental works that made me interested in what I'm interested in. So the Varieties of Religious Experience by William James up here in the left. We have Friedrich Nietzsche and the Genealogy of Morals. He kind of has a PIMSS-like view of how Judeo-Christian morality emerged from situations of oppression and stress. We have Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy by Eliade, which is kind of a cross-cultural comparison of shamanic traditions. And then we have some interesting ideas by Julian Jaynes about auditory hallucinations being caused by stress and people living not too long ago that weren't fully self-conscious. So if you haven't read any of these things, it's a little outside the scope of the domains of psychology today, but very interesting. Here to the right, I have some of my undergraduate professors who entertained my bizarre notions, 2 neuroscientists and 2 religious studies scholars. So I studied religious studies and neuroscience in undergrad. Beside them on the right, I have some mentors that worked with me at Boston University School of Theology, where I studied the scientific study of religion. So we worked a lot on the cognitive science of religion, which I don't talk about too much in this presentation, but that was pretty fundamental to my understandings as well. And then recently what I did is I took the master's thesis I wrote at the School of Theology. It wasn't getting me anywhere career-wise or anything. And so I was reading Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. I realized that Carhart Harris had been a psychoanalyst trained in psychoanalysis. And I thought, oh, maybe he's interested in some of these ideas because there is this psychoanalytic component. So I sent the work off to him, and that's how PIMSS was born. It's really a kind of a mutual collaboration. I have to give Robin the credit actually for coming up with the term pivotal mental states. Before, I was just comparing spiritual experience and psychosis and looking at the serotonin 2A receptor. And then in the bottom right, here's my mentor right now. That is Chuck Raison at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And there is we're increasingly looking at psychedelics here at University of Wisconsin-Madison. So that's where I'm at right now doing my PhD. Okay, off to the content part. Pivotal mental states. So our paper presents a process-based approach to psychological transformation, whereby chronic stress predisposes individuals towards a pivotal mental state. Acute stress triggers the pivotal mental state. The pivotal mental state itself is characterized by elevated cortical plasticity, an enhanced rate of associative learning, and an enhanced capacity to mediate psychological transformation. This pivotal mental state then might lead to psychological change. It's not guaranteed that a state showing these characteristics, for instance, a psychedelic state, will lead to psychological change. It could just be an enjoyable psychedelic experience, a transient psychotic-like experience, and nothing might change afterwards. But the PIMSS itself creates an opportunity for this psychological change. And two of the types of PIMSS we talk about, and two of the outcomes from PIMSS we talk about the most in our paper, is spiritual experience and psychosis. For a long time, people have realized that there are similarities in spiritual experience and psychosis. There's a common phenomenology just meaning the subjective first-person experience. So anomalous self-experience, this could be ego dissolution, which could either be felt as union with the divine or an anxiety-inducing ego dissolution. The phenomenologists of schizophrenia really focus on this anomalous self-experience. So if you haven't read the works of Joseph Parnas, I suggest looking into that. He's in Copenhagen, and just wonderful stuff on the phenomenology of schizophrenia. Unusual perceptual experiences, these are the obvious ones we think of when we think of psychosis and spiritual experience. So visions or visual hallucinations, and hearing the voices of God, or so auditory hallucinations in schizophrenia. Magical thinking, this is believing thoughts can influence reality, or likewise, there's causal relationships between events that are kind of implausible from other people's perspectives. So prayer could be an example. Believe in mind reading is another example. And spiritual experience and psychosis share increased emotional tone. Now, in spiritual experience is generally a felt positive emotional tone, so joy, well-being, feeling of salvation, or something of that sort. In psychosis, we tend to think of paranoia and suspiciousness, perhaps anger and hostility. But there's a lot of overlap here. In incipient psychosis, there's actually quite a few mystical type experiences occurring. And in kind of challenging spiritual experiences, a lot of fear as well. So this distinction is just general. There's obviously a lot of overlap. One of the reasons, there's many reasons why scholars have maintained strict distinctions between spiritual experience and psychosis for a long time. One is that the divergent outcomes obscure common root states. So psychotic disorder diagnoses require dysfunction, whereas for most kind of spiritual practitioners to designate an experience as a spiritual experience, the experience must bear fruits. So does the experience lead to a greater sense of well-being, greater cooperation with one's peers, or does it create alienation and kind of foment beliefs that are antisocial? And so in retrospect, you can say, oh, that person was struggling and had a really meaningful experience that increased their connection to other people. That was a spiritual experience. Or in retrospect, you can say that person was really struggling and just deteriorated further, and it was a psychotic experience. And just because you have a transient psychotic experience does not mean you will develop an enduring psychotic disorder. So it's not just the spiritual experience and the psychotic experience per se that resemble each other. There's actual spiritual quest and schizophrenia prodrome that precede kind of the most intense forms of experience that also relate to each other. So in the schizophrenia prodrome, you notice an anhedonian amotivation for hedonic and vocational pursuits. A person might stop going to school, drop out of school, stop going to work, become uninterested in money, sex, other kind of what most people would say are pleasurable pursuits. And you see this in spiritual kind of exemplars too. Here, Francis of Assisi on the right gave up all his worldly possessions and went into nature to lead a spiritual life. And so also in the schizophrenia prodrome, you see increased interest in spiritual, paranormal, and ritual domains. And this is particularly the case in longer prodromes. So, you know, the prodrome, which is in retrospect, it's an identifiable period leading up to a first psychotic episode in schizophrenia. And in longer prodromes, you know, which could last months to years, in many people, you can see a shift in interest from, you know, previous worldly pursuits towards interest in these spiritual, paranormal, and ritual domains. Here I just list some ages at which some of these religious exemplars kind of got on their spiritual kick. And we notice that, you know, in the first, you know, at least 3-4 instances, their interest in spirituality, in some senses, developed later in life. Whereas Saint Anthony, who I had pictured on the previous slide, who is being assaulted here by demons, and this is an artistic rendering of a biographical account of his life. He began his spiritual quest earlier, and if you look at his biography, actually had a more kind of a, his phenotype, I guess you could say, resembled more of a schizophrenia phenotype. And so there might be a relationship here with age of onset in terms of what kind of the likelihood of having types of experiences that can be integrated successfully. Now, you can ask whether the development of a kind of the schizophrenic type experience contrasts with the development of manic psychosis, because in manic psychoses, sometimes you actually get increased pleasure and motivation for hedonic and vocational pursuits. So someone can become extra interested in sex, extra interested in pursuing goal-related behaviors, and then the spiritual interests actually emerge quite late into the development of the hypomania or mania. And we'll talk a little bit maybe about the differences in the routes towards psychosis, schizotypal route or the manic route later when we talk a little bit about the psychopharmacology of what's going on here. So part of the PIMSS argument is that there's common causes to psychosis and spiritual experience. And the ones we focus on are stressors, various types of stressors. So social stressors, there's a social defeat model of schizophrenia, which says, you know, basically all these factors that reduce social status predispose individuals towards schizophrenia, whether this is ethnic minority status, perhaps low IQ, disadvantage of various forms, kind of identifiable social defeats in life, not being married, living alone. And some of these social stressors also appear to increase incidence of spiritual experience or facilitate spiritual experience. So loss of a loved one will oftentimes cause someone to have a kind of a experience of sensed presence of the deceased loved one. St. Anthony here, again, pictured in the top left, he lost his parents at the age of 20. And shortly thereafter, he gave away all of his wealth, sent his sister to a convent of sorts, and went out into the wilderness of Egypt. He lived in the 3rd century CE in Egypt, and he's known as the father of all monks in the Christian tradition. Physiological stressors are another big one. You know, starvation will facilitate psychosis, and fasting is obviously a religious practice. Hypoxia, low oxygen, can induce near-death experiences or psychotic-like phenomenon. Pain can, you know, in terms of torture and stuff, can induce psychotic type phenotypes. There's a lot on the physiological stressors. We'll get more into those on the next slide where we talk about ascetic practices and torture. Cognitive stressors. We talk about cognitive stressors, and like we mentioned, like depression and trauma, anxiety and stuff like this. Now you could say, well, is that really stress causing the psychotic phenotype, or really just those elements are present already in a kind of some forms of psychotic like experience? So there's a little bit of a chicken and an egg type question there with the cognitive stressors. But yeah, I mean, depression is like an evident feature in a lot of schizophrenia prodromes. In the spiritual quest, people are often dissatisfied with life. And obviously, you know, before manic psychoses, oftentimes people are having depressive episodes. So I've mentioned these cases of Francis of Assisi and St. Anthony the Great here, two religious examples of people on the spiritual quest. Here I have a picture of Friedrich Nietzsche, because he's an example of someone who went psychotic at a later age, 44. And, there's a lot of argument, why did Nietzsche have a psychotic break? But he experienced all these stressors in his life too. His dad died at a young age. He was physically sick most of his life. He also abused a fair amount of drugs from what we know. And he got in arguments a lot with people. His whole style of argumentation was fairly polemical and stuff. So you can see similar trajectories. It's not just people, it's not always the psychotic, expression is not always related to spiritual phenotypes. It can be there's intellectual, radical forms of psychotic-like thinking as well. So I think this is one of the most interesting parts of our piece is talking about the intentional use of stress to induce pivotal mental states. So, we have some correlational evidence that, just stressors in someone's life that they can't control predispose individuals towards spiritual experience and psychosis. But what's fascinating about humanity is that we've actually been inducing stress on ourselves or on others for thousands of years to induce either spiritual experiences or to kind of manipulate the mind and break down someone's identity so we can get information or try and change the way they think. So these are practices used by ascetics to induce religious experiences in themselves. Sleep deprivation, fasting is a common religious practice. Isolation, a lot of your religious exemplars will go off into the wilderness for religious experience. Pain, so self-mortification, common in various initiation rituals. Hypoxia, you can relate this one's up in the air in terms of, well, how much do different breathing techniques actually induced hypoxia? Some maybe more so than others. In terms of torture, waterboarding might induce hypoxia, enhanced interrogation techniques, if you want to call it that. And then temperature manipulation. So getting really hot in a sweat lodge, for instance, or a sauna, or getting perhaps very cold, except we know less about that. So here I have two, pictures. On the right is the emaciated Buddha who apparently experienced enlightenment after a period of intense fasting. And in the middle here, these are stylites or Christian ascetics. This form of asceticism was popular, I guess, at least in the imagination, in Syria, again, in early Christianity, and they would live on top of these pillars, and just by virtue of living on top of these pillars, they would kind of subject themselves to all of these stressors. And then we can say, stress obviously isn't the only way to induce something that looks like a spiritual or psychotic experience. You also have sensory overload, entrainment, or deprivation. So, in torture, they'll repetitively bombard someone with music or deprive them of all sensory information. And in religious rituals, you also get either a tendency towards extreme kind of sensory experience and coordinated dance and music, or relative sensory deprivation. So meditation, being alone, and reflection. So how does stress cause PIMS? Well, the idea is that the stress actually increases pro-hallucinogenic activation of serotonin 2A receptors. And, in humans, there's not great causative evidence of this, because you can't just stress someone out really hard and block the 2A receptor and see if they have a psychedelic-like experience. You could foreseeably do this, and we've thought about this, could we have people that voluntarily inhale CO2 and see if that induces a psychedelic-like experience, and then block the serotonin 2A receptor with an antagonist and see if that ameliorates the effects of the CO2 on experience. So there's actually, there might be ways to get around the ethical hurdles in actually testing these ideas. But there is a lot of evidence that stresses in various animal models, and just if you look at stress associated with people's lives, that there seems to be an upregulation of serotonin 2A receptor expression in the brain, and a sensitization of serotonin 2A receptor signaling in response to psychedelic agonists. So for instance, if you take rat pups that were separated from their mums early in life and you give them LSD or something later in life, they'll demonstrate increased behavioral response to the LSD. And why is this important? Well, the serotonin 2A receptor mediates the main subjective effects of psychedelics. So, now there's pretty good evidence that the intensity of the psychedelic experience is very much related to the occupancy of the serotonin 2A receptor. So I just have a figure here on the right showing that. And psychedelics, this makes sense because, alternative names for psychedelics include psychotomimetic, so a psychosis mimicking agent, and entheogenic, which means an agent capable of like eliciting the divine or something of that sort. So why does stress increase psychedelic signaling in the brain? Well, we propose that the activation of serotonin 2A receptors promotes radical adaptation, or in cases when it doesn't work, maladaptation, by elevating cortical plasticity and enhancing rates of associative learning. The elevating cortical plasticity in terms of structural neuroplasticity seems pretty reliable. I mean, BDNF increases in the cortex under psychedelics have been shown repeatedly. In terms of functional neuroplasticity, this is less clear in terms of how psychedelics influence things like long-term potentiation or long-term depression. So actually that's like that's definitely an avenue for future research to delineate those mechanisms. And then two, enhancing rate of associative learning. We put this as a mechanism of PIMSS, but I mean, the way we use the term associative learning is so broad. A lot of people would operationalize associative learning to mean something much more specific than how we're using it, which is basically like connections between ideas and all types of connections are basically enhanced under the psychedelic state. And these connections seem important after the psychedelic experience. And also there's some evidence of increased unlearning of previous associations. So, the adaptive function of the pivotal mental states, this isn't really a new idea. Our work builds on, so Robin and David Nutt wrote this Serotonin and Brain Function, A Tale of Two Receptors. And Murnane in 2019 wrote a paper about serotonin 2A receptors as a stress response system, really showing how maybe activation of the serotonin 2A receptor is implicated in post-traumatic stress disorder. And the idea that somehow these processes associated with both kind of spiritual experience and psychosis are related to learning and the creation of new ideas has been around for a long time. So Nietzsche has this kind of great quote: "When new and deviant ideas, evaluations, drives again broke out, they did so accompanied by a dreadful attendant. Almost everywhere it was madness which prepared the way for the new idea." And it's pretty ironic that, Nietzsche, who viewed himself as his life task is transvaluing values or reevaluating how everyone thought about values, that he himself went psychotic at a later date. So this is something I've been thinking about more recently, which is just another potential adaptive function of PIMSS that relates to learning. It's neuroprotection. So it could be actually that psychedelics are being released in the brain either primarily or just secondarily to protect the brain against physiological insult. So on the left, I have a picture of this light at the end of the tunnel, which is kind of commonly referred to in near-death experiences. And during a near-death experience, which is often induced by hypoxia. So during cardiac arrest, a lack of oxygen, a buildup of CO2, someone has a near-death experience, the release of endogenous psychedelics or just whatever endogenous neurotransmitter is stimulating the serotonin 2A receptor, this could actually protect the brain against whatever physiological insults arise from the hypoxia. Another potential example is maybe some of you have been in a car crash and time slows down. I mean, the agents that slow down time or really manipulate time most reliably seem to be these psychedelics or NMDA receptor antagonists, so dissociative anesthetics. And it's possible the brain's actually preparing for imminent, injury, and somehow that protects the brain if that injury does occur. And some of these ideas are actually being, explored, or maybe not these exact examples, but the really the role of psychedelics in protecting against traumatic brain injury are being explored by these sources that I'm listing below. So in relation to that neuroprotection effect and how that relates to potentially these adaptive learning effects, these are some ideas that I've been exploring recently, where it seems that a lot of the psychedelic, psychotic-like, spiritual type responses to stress seem to be compensating for other either sickness, injury responses to stress that kind of link into normal behavioral responses to social loss, or pathogenic kind of social responses to social loss. So if you think about a normal sickness or injury response, which increases inflammation, a compensation against that would be an anti-inflammatory neuroprotective response, perhaps an adaptive learning response, so you don't get sick or injured again. A normal response to social loss or threat would be, at least a short-term withdrawal or submission to whatever source of the threat, so you don't get pounded on or something by an adversary. But then maybe you want to socially reevaluate the situation, decide that adversary is a real jerk, and prepare to re-engage with new behavior. And a pathogenic response to social threat or loss would be depression, where there's an experience of shame, guilt, grief. And if you look at depression, why I'm saying that sickness and injury responses related to depression is because kind of some of the behavioral elements of depression, such as like lethargy, are related to kind of just like how we feel when we have a fever or when we're sick or injured. And a compensation for this depression type response would be either kind of a spiritual experience where one accepts their situation or becomes more loving or cooperative to social threats, or a psychotic type response where you develop persecutory, grandiose, nonconformist thinking. And instead of cooperation, maybe your kind of behavioral expressions look more like either isolating yourself or acting aggressive towards potential threats. And you can see how, some of these psychotic-like responses to social threat or loss aren't always maladaptive. So for instance, if people are making fun of you all the time, or you feel alienated, it's not always good to feel ashamed of yourself or guilty. Perhaps in some circumstances you are justified in thinking that you're persecuted by others, and it might be advantageous to believe that you can change your situation. So back to the kind of the PIMSS, those last two slides were kind of extensions that went along with the adaptive learning aspect of PIMSS. Well, because we're talking about how a similar process can lead to spiritual experience or psychosis, it really kind of raises questions of, well, how do we balance the benefits and risks associated with psychedelic therapy? So these are the conditions, if we look at the right, that we think are most likely to lead to a negative pivotal mental state, or a pivotal mental state that leads to a negative psychological outcome. And they involve a lot of chronic acute stress in contexts of adversity. Now, one approach would be, oh, well, let's try and just not ever let this pivotal mental state manifest. But that doesn't actually really take care of the chronic stress or the adversity that's leading to the kind of attempt at adaptation. Perhaps, even if someone might be slightly vulnerable towards a psychotic experience, it might still be, in some instances, more beneficial to try and induce the pivotal mental state, or allow features of psychosis to emerge, but try and allow those features to emerge in a very positive, supportive context. And then maybe we can actually get a kind of a behavioral adaptation that protects against the recurrence of distress in the future and a positive psychological outcome. And this really goes into the essential importance of context in our paper. So yeah, I think I'll end that. Now that's kind of a review of PIMSS. That was a long review, I guess. Where have I been moving since the PIMSS piece? Well, because we mentioned the relationship of the serotonin 2A receptor to psychosis, I think it's pretty important to situate the serotonin 2A receptor in the broader psychotomimetic perspective. Psychedelics are not the only drug that models psychosis, and for some aspects of psychosis, they're not the best model at all. For instance, in some ways, cannabis or THC and amphetamines are more likely to produce paranoia than psychedelics, and some disorganized features of psychosis, NMDA antagonists, so dissociative anesthetics like ketamine, they're the best models of psychosis. So one way to view psychosis is that it's really a developmental process of either stress or drugs targeting all these systems. And the thing about it is, if you hit one system, if you agonize, and cannabinoid receptors, that upregulates expression eventually of serotonin 2A receptors. Eventually it leads to a sensitization of dopaminergic systems. Activation of the serotonin 2A receptors leads to dopamine release and eventually to dopamine sensitization. Some of the effects of ketamine seem to be reliant upon the serotonin 2A receptor. So if you block the serotonin 2A receptor, you won't get some of the behavioral responses to ketamine. Moreover, dopamine in high concentrations seems to be an agonist at the serotonin 2A receptor. So in terms of understanding psychosis, I think it's really important to, if you want to take a drug model view of psychosis, a neurotransmitter model, then to understand how these systems interact with each other. All these black lines in this diagram represent like stimulation of the one system will increase whatever I have mentioned as the effect on another system. And what I think is kind of nice about this little diagram, although I would need to fix this up and make it nicer if I ever wanted to elaborate on the ideas, is that it explains how both stress and drugs can lead towards psychosis, and how it's really a developmental process. This dopaminergic sensitization isn't going to happen right away. This would be repetitive engagement with all these systems. But then there's also the question, well, what about depression? I mean, it seems like in depression, you'd actually have less activity at all these systems. And so this transient inhibition of signaling could then sensitize the system to the next time that it's activated, leading to even kind of more drastic sensitization effects. And then, after a while, you do have the enduring dopaminergic sensitization that is related to enduring psychotic phenotypes. This is a question of debate. So, I've been going along with the psychotomimetic sensitization model of psychosis. Is psychedelic use associated with psychosis or schizotypy? Lebedev and colleagues just published a recent article saying there is an association, a small positive correlation between psychedelic use and schizotypy. But if you control for use of other drugs and mental illness, then this relationship kind of diminishes to almost non-importance. And this is basically what a lot of people find. If you control for mental health issues and use of other drugs, the relationship between use of psychedelics and schizotypy is not very strong. Now, some people like Nesvag and colleagues have pushed back on this, and they're like, well, why are you controlling for other drug use in particular, maybe also mental health issues, when a significant proportion of the population that uses psychedelics also uses other drugs. So there's debates, I guess, in this. And John Studd here kind of brings up some of these considerations in a recent review, saying like, well, who is the typical psychedelic user? And depending on which population you're giving surveys to, or who's responding to your surveys, or whether you're looking actually at inpatient populations, or homeless populations are usually left out of some of these surveys and stuff too. So there's some methodological challenges here. Here's an interesting article published in 1998 that just shows, it kind of shows a risk associated with the psychotomimetic sensitization model, whereas you get increased drug use that wouldn't be correlated to increased rates of mood disorders or psychosis until a while later, because it's just the initial sensitization of the psychotomimetic process. And then that takes a while to manifest in mood disorder or schizophrenia. So you have a leap of drug-related admissions in Connecticut state hospitals from 1969 to 1971 at peaks. And then only really like 5 years later do you see this increased incidence of first admission for schizophrenia and mood-related disorders. Something to keep in mind with this psychedelic renaissance. I personally am not so much concerned with the safety of clinical supervised psychedelic experiences. What concerns me more is the recreational use of psychedelics in the population. Here's another figure from Krebs and Johansson. So in this 2013 study, I believe they say, we found with the adjusted data, we found no indication that using psychedelics is associated with mental health problems or specific psychotic symptoms in the last year. But if you look at the unadjusted data, you got about a twofold, it's 2 times more specific psychotic symptoms amongst people who've ever used psychedelics, and about twice these symptoms of specific mental disorders in the past year. So again, a question of, do you want to control for the confounds? And yeah. So I'm also not just, worried about, I guess, psychosis per se or specific psychotic symptoms. I'm also thinking a lot in terms of pivotal mental states and psychotic-like worldviews. So typically we think of psychosis in terms of the diagnostic criteria, at least in the States, we do this a lot, hallucinations and delusions, right? Positive psychotic symptoms, then you have negative and disorganized symptoms. But the phenomenologists have, recognized that there's actually kind of psychotic-like worldviews, common views of the world that are common, particularly in schizophrenia, which is a rejection of society or convention, an extreme openness to values and ideas, but oddly, that's mixed with an absolute certitude about anomalous interpretations of the world. And there's also a tendency to be very skeptical of obvious or taken for granted information. There's a feeling of being special or superior, an adherence to abstract, intellectual, or autonomous rules, and an intellectual change that is characterized by an unusual preoccupation with existential, metaphysical, religious, philosophical, or psychological themes. And this is interesting to me because I mean, this is a lot of anecdotal stuff, but I perceive a lot of these characteristics and certain trends associated with the counterculture of the late 1960s and early 70s in the United States. And I see some of these characteristics reemerging, particularly in the States. That's not to say they're caused by psychedelics. Actually, I think recently kind of an increase in these types of worldviews might be more related to stress and kinds of social stressors that are, maybe resulting from our political situations or the pandemic. So here on the right, I have this great example of kind of loose, disorganized, psychotic-like thinking. And this is an example of what you might call conspirituality, or the confluence of spiritual ideologies with conspiracy thinking. So this map was designed by Champ Perinya, who described himself as a follower of Terence McKenna originally, but then he's become increasingly interested in QAnon and conspiracy theories. And this trend from being interested in spiritual kind of new age themes to being interested in conspiracy theories is noticed in some people. Obviously not everyone's going to make that transition. And so on this map, we see some references to the psychedelic renaissance, DMT, Terence McKenna, but we also see QAnon down here, you know, just something that I think to watch out for. And it's something I'm interested in, at least. So if this is possible, you know, if it's possible, psychedelics, you know, in the right context can facilitate kind of these psychotic like worldviews. How do we help or guide or just maintain philosophical perspectives that promote pro-social change or pro-social responses to psychedelics? And spiritual traditions have long offered kind of advice on these fronts. So for instance, in the Christian tradition, humility is known as the antidote to pride, and temperance is advised to protect against spiritual addiction or addiction to anything for that matter. In Buddhist traditions, correlates might be selflessness and equanimity, for example. And so I just want to contrast these views of humility from Friedrich Nietzsche, who we mentioned, had kind of these psychotic-like worldviews. And he says, when stepped on, the worm curls up. That is a clever thing to do. Thus, it reduces its chances of being stepped on again. In the language of morality, humility. So a pretty negative view of humility. And Nietzsche had some negative views of his contemporaries and their kind of their morality. Not that they were all unjustified. He's just his style of thinking was very argumentative. And you see this style of thinking in some kind of lone actor radicals too. So if you want an example of someone whose philosophy is very much like Nietzsche's, you can look at Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber in the States. It's almost a recapitulation of some of Nietzsche's ideas. An alternative view of humility is presented by C.S. Lewis, where humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. And one of the reasons this could be beneficial is that, you know, if we think about what pride is, or how some Christian traditions conceptualize pride, there's two components to pride. One's grandiosity, thinking you're really great, and the other is thinking your ideas are particularly good, which is just kind of an idiosyncratic element of pride, thinking, you know, I might not be great, but I have the right ideas. And so making sure we don't fall into those traps, I think, is pretty important. So totally new direction now. Adaptive stressors. Do we need psychedelics to induce these types of beneficial personality change, or can we use stressors to you know, keep our brains kind of plastic? And I'm not saying we're ever going to have the types of experience. Most people are probably not going to be able to induce the types of experiences that psychedelics can elicit by exercising or sitting in a sauna or fasting. But in some ways, these interventions may also be preferable in terms of maybe more sustainable in certain ways. And so, you know, all these methods, these adaptive stressors, increase brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and there might be psychedelics might contribute to that, for instance, or dissociative anesthetics. So exercise, for instance, increases chynurenic acid in the brain, which is an NMDA receptor antagonist. Endocannabinoids are believed to be released during exercise as well. And you get something in exercise called a runner's high, which reflects this kind of psychedelic-like state. So yeah, and the serotonergic systems and tryptophan metabolism and stuff, they're all engaged in these responses to stress. So we don't necessarily need drugs to engage these systems. And I guess I don't want to go too far into this. So I'll leave it at that. All right. I have no idea how long that took because I was just riffing, but we'll stop there.
That was perfect. Let me just stop the recording for a second.